Hello and welcome to The Print. I have with me today Mr. Kevin Rudd. He is the former Prime Minister of Australia and presently President of Asia Society. Welcome to The Print, Mr. Rudd. Thank you so much for talking to us.
It's good to be back in Delhi and good to be with The Print.
Thank you so much. So we will first, of course, discuss the book. And now you have authored this book, The Avoidable War, The Dangers of a Catastrophic Conflict Between the US and Xi Jinping's China. What made you write the book, and what is it that you discovered about China that has changed? Because I believe when you, in one of your lectures in India, you did say probably there's a difference between Hu Jintao's China and Xi Jinping's China. So if you can tell our viewers a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think what has changed with China is two or three things. Xi Jinping has now been in power for the last 10 years. And over that 10-year period, China has become more powerful militarily, economically, technologically, in its strategic competition with the United States. And so when the balance of power begins to change, therefore strategic behaviors begin to change. The second change has been the nature of Xi Jinping's leadership itself. By instinct and predisposition, he's a much more assertive leader, wanting to change China's domestic and foreign policy landscape in the direction of China's national interests. And the third reason I think why this is now much sharper is because the United States over the last 5 years has begun to strategically respond, both Republicans and Democrats, and you now see the emergence of a much more fundamental bipartisan US national China strategy. That's why this is much sharper than it was before.
Mm-hmm. So if I can ask you in simple terms, why this so much of belligerence from Chinese side? Is it only to give shape to Xi Jinping's ambitions? And going forward, how do we see that shaping up as far as the neighborhood is concerned?
Well, I've been a student of China now for the last 40 years, since I began studying Chinese language and history at the Australian National University way back when. Before you were born. And what I've discovered over that period of time is I look carefully, therefore, at what Chinese political leaders say ideologically to their own party and their own country. And Xi Jinping's overriding ideological mission is as follows: to make China become the preeminent global power regionally and globally by 2049. He uses the term the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. The Chinese word for it is the 中华民族伟大复兴, which is an expression which says for China once again to be as powerful as it was in earlier imperial times. So therefore, if we accept that that's China's strategic ambition to become that powerful, it follows that the rest of us who prefer the status quo are going to find ourselves with some structural difficulty in our response to China.
Mm-hmm. And then also, what about the PLA, the Chinese army? A lot is being discussed about that in India. We saw, unfortunately, the event that had happened in June 2020 with the Galwan clash. Now, is the PLA also geared up to match the ambitions that Xi Jinping has?
That's a very important question. In Xi Jinping's worldview, the modernization of the Chinese military is one of his major ambitions. He launched a PLA reform program in 2015. He's indicated he wants to see it completed by 2027. He's consolidated China's military regions from 7 down to 5. There is a huge campaign to produce what we describe as integrated joint operations between all four services of the Chinese armed services, naval forces, air forces, land forces, but now also information logistics as well. When will this be effectively completed? This is a very big program. I would not suspect that Xi Jinping would be happy with the level of military preparedness until the late 20s, early 30s. But that assumes, of course, that the rest of us remain static, as opposed to our own capabilities changing as well.
So if I can ask you now, coming to your book a little bit, and then of course I'll go with relationship with India, How serious are these tensions between US and China? Because initially, the discourse in India was that it's only about trade and they'll settle this. But then we saw them meeting, US and the Chinese side, the national security advisors were meeting. Now, your book talk about an imminent war, probably that should be avoided. But how deeper these tensions can go, do you think, or do you really think this is another probably Cold War 2.0?
When we look at the future, it is important for us to be analytically clear. Cold War 1.0 was between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it was at a time when there was complete strategic standoff, mutually assured destruction through each other's intercontinental ballistic missiles, zero economic engagement, and a pronounced ideological war. This is somewhat different for all those reasons. But what we're now seeing with the US-China relationship is certainly foreign policy decoupling. What we are seeing also are forms of economic decoupling, particularly in the area of technology. We're also seeing the emergence of an ideological contest between the two sides. But still, financial markets, US and Chinese financial services market, as of today, is about $5 trillion. It's big. So therefore, we need to have an analytical frame on this which understands its complexity as opposed to the relative simplicity of the previous Cold War. On the possibility of armed conflict, crisis, and war, once upon a time, this would have been seen as a 1 out of 10 possibility because of Taiwan. My judgment now is it's become probably 4 out of 10, but it is rising. And that's because Xi Jinping's ambition is that he says he cannot achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation by 2049 without bringing Taiwan back under Chinese sovereignty. So if you like, we're on a 27-year fuse between now and 2049. And therefore, we are entering into a period of what I describe as living dangerously, strategically.
So as a precursor to the larger war, do you think China will first attack Taiwan?
Well, the truth is the most likely tripwire for a general conflict between the United States and China is Taiwan. You can see the possibility of limited conflicts in the South China Sea, larger conflicts in the East China Sea, where America's treaty ally Japan is located. But in Taiwan, under the terms of the Taiwan Relations Act, and because of the nature of US strategic thinking and its domestic politics, if China moved unilaterally militarily against Taiwan to take the island, I think it is more probable than not that the United States would respond militarily and with force.
So now a lot of question is being raised as to what is the future for Xi Jinping as an individual. We are having the 20th National Congress coming up of the Chinese Communist Party. How do you assess that? What do you think will happen? Because what we read from the Chinese publications is that maybe he's going to be the next Mao Zedong. You can give a clearer picture.
Well, I've made some study of Xi Jinping's career and his ideology. And in fact, I've just completed a 4-year research project at Oxford on Xi Jinping's ideological framework. So Xi Jinping at the level of pure politics will definitely be reappointed as the party's supreme leader at the 20th Congress this October, November. For me, there is no doubt about that, no doubt at all. The real question is whether, when that happens, whether he also appoints a premier and an economic team capable of dealing with China's unfolding economic problems, slowing economic growth, non-business friendly economic policies, demographic challenges with an aging population and a shrinking population and a shrinking workforce. And that is a big question we need to focus on. Furthermore, I see Xi Jinping politically determined to remain in office until the late 2030s because he knows that if he was to stand down from office, there is a risk that he and his family would be purged by those whom he's alienated already in Chinese domestic politics. So we should get used to a long-term political reality of Xi Jinping in Beijing and Vladimir Putin in Moscow. I think that's going to be the case through the rest of the 20s and through most of the 30s.
You talk about their economic problems. I remember you talking about the same in one of your lectures about the Achilles heel that's going to be their economic growth. But if they are really looking towards a slower growth period, where do you see the Belt and Road Initiative is now headed? And the fact that many countries are now realizing that BRI is their sure shot, direct path towards debt. Do you think BRI is headed as it was planned to be?
It's an important question about the future of the BRI. The Asia Society, of which I'm president in New York, we've done a series of recent studies on the implementation of the BRI. And the truth is, it's a mixed picture wherever you are in the world. There are many countries in Africa which welcome the BRI because there are no alternative sources of investment. Still, there are other countries, such as Sri Lanka, who may be experiencing levels of what we call buyer's remorse, which is suddenly I had to hand over a port for 99 years. But internally within China itself, there is some reappraisal. When it was initially launched, this was seen as a $3 trillion initiative. Now it's probably resulted in perhaps 1 trillion in current and planned expenditures. But China also is under fiscal restraint, financial restraint as well.
Okay. Now, talking about India, do you think as Chinese growth sort of slows down, will their belligerence towards India increase? Where do you see this present military standoff headed? And do you ever see in future the border dispute will be resolved?
Well, as you know, this is an ancient border dispute. It predated the War of 1962. Zhou Enlai and Pandit Nehru began looking at what a compromise might look like. The border war of 62 destroyed that, and that's now 60 years ago. And so the evidence in recent times, and certainly since Deng Xiaoping, is that, and certainly under Xi Jinping, is over time to change the reality on the ground with the border, pushing here, pushing there, and pushing in other places as well, in order to enhance China's overall territorial position along the border. And of course, this has been reinforced by infrastructure construction on the Chinese side, road and airfields, etc. So therefore, I do not see any evidence from China's general strategic behavior, either with the Sino-Indian border, in the South China Sea, over Taiwan, or in the East China Sea, that China is about to land upon a diplomatic compromise. That's not currently in evidence. I don't rule out the possibility, however, that in the long term, by which I mean after 5 or 10 years, that maybe if Xi Jinping reaches a strategic decision that it's better for him to finally resolve the border for a range of other strategic reasons, that this would be a wise thing to do. So we should not rule out the possibility, but it's a possibility. It's not a probability.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Now, the fact that it is because of this Chinese increased sort of aggression that India is now looking at securing its maritime domain. And, for the first time, India came into Quad wholeheartedly and also had Australia in the Malabar exercises. If you can give us a little history on that, the fact that India was a little reluctant, and now do you see going forward, will India really give sort of more teeth to Quad?
I think from the Australian side, and certainly from the Japanese side, and my think tank is an American think tank, so I live and work in the United States, and certainly from the American side, India's full participation in combined military naval exercises under Malabar with all 4 Quad partners is welcomed. I think it's also useful for the Indian Naval Service itself. And I think Indian naval commanders would fully agree with that. And secondly, when you look at the future pattern of Indian naval and broader military equipment purchases, there'll be an increased predisposition to look to the United States in terms of long-term supply. Furthermore, I think with the Quad itself, those who designed the Quad, I think, have been quite clever in what President Biden has done. And that is, it is a flexible vehicle. Right now, it's not described as a military partnership. It's a foreign policy summit. It's a political summit. It's a framework for economic cooperation and increasingly for technological cooperation. And I noticed recently on climate change as well. So it becomes a wide vehicle for a range of collaborative activities. But because of that, I think those who have designed it flexibly so that it can expand vertically or horizontally in the future and become, shall I say, more military over time as circumstances demand. But I think there's a lot of wisdom on the part of those who are in charge of our respective countries now in seeking to move this effectively but gradually.
Mr. Rudd, my last question to you will be in terms of the Indo-Pacific. Now, India's foreign policy is now totally dependent on the Indo-Pacific, it seems, but we do have a lot of players in it. Then we also have the Russia-Ukraine war going on, and what we get to hear is that, that war will have an implication on the Indo-Pacific. However, India is not believing in that. India wants to remain neutral in this. But do you really think, and you also spoke about Xi Jinping and Putin coming closer, how do you see these dynamics working out as far as India is concerned?
Well, for Delhi, the strategic triangle between Delhi, Moscow and Beijing has always been complicated, going back to, frankly, 1947. And certainly since the birth of the People's Republic of China in 1949. I think in the United States, Japan and Australia, there is a deep understanding of the fact that the historical relationship between Delhi and Moscow, particularly on the question of military purchases, and to a lesser extent on energy purchases, is long-standing and will only change over time. And so I do not detect a high degree of strategic angst in those three capitals about India's current relationship with Moscow and over Russia and over Ukraine. For the long term, India seems to have reached a conclusion that its principal strategic challenge does lie with China. And whether it's on the Sino-Indian border, whether it's over Kashmir, whether it's over Pakistan and China's all-weather alliance with Islamabad, or over the Indian Ocean, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, the Maldives, etc. So for these reasons, India's strategy has now become clearer, and therefore its strategic partners have become clearer. And this will, I think, unfold over time, but without an immediate and abrupt rupture with Russia.
But what about economics? Because India is still dependent on China. As far as economic ties are concerned, imports are still huge. We are not part of the RCEP, unfortunately or fortunately. But how do you think India can, effectively decouple itself from that?
When I look at the economic data, both in terms of foreign direct investment and the trade data, India, remarkably, is not excessively dependent on China. The investment relationship remains thin, actually. And so India, I think, will progressively look for its principal strategic partners in the United States, in the European Union, in Japan, and to a lesser extent, Australia and Southeast Asia. This level of diversification, in my judgment, makes a lot of sense. But also, India should take some comfort in the fact that the economic policy settings here in Delhi are increasingly underpinning strong economic growth. The fact that despite all the external economic headwinds, you're still growing at 6 to 7%. China at present is around about 2 to 3. Means that the key to the future, as India's government, I think, has already concluded, lies in continuing strong domestic economic growth here in Mother India itself. If that happens, and increasingly you're economically engaged with, let's call it, the rest of the democratic world, then I think there are great economic prospects for this country.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Rudd. On that note, this is Nayanima Basu from ThePrint signing off, and with me on camera is Reeti and Urjita. Thank you so much for watching.